orphaned black girl approaches a billionaire and says 2 words, he instantly bursts into tears. It sounds impossible until it happens right outside a glass corporate tower. A powerful billionaire is rushing to the most important meeting of his life when a small orphaned black girl stops him cold. She sings just 2 words, and the man who owns everything completely breaks down. Those words come from a lullaby only his long-lost mother ever knew. A mother the world says disappeared forever. So how does this child know the song? As their lives collide, a hidden past begins to surface. Secrets buried by money, power, and silence. And the same fortune that made him rich may be tied to the very pain that orphaned her. Was this meeting an accident or a second chance sent too late? And when the truth finally comes out, will it destroy him or save them both? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The morning sun glinted off the sleek glass towers, casting long shadows across the busy financial district. Luca Moretti's polished leather shoes clicked against the sidewalk as he approached the gleaming skyscraper that bore his family name. His mind was a rapid-fire calculator, running through profit margins and market projections for the upcoming board meeting. 8.5% growth, he muttered under his breath, rehearsing the figures that would either please or enrage the board members waiting for him on the 40th floor. Numbers were safe. Numbers made sense. Unlike the messy, unpredictable nature of emotions and relationships, numbers never abandoned you without explanation. The cool autumn air carried the sounds of the awakening city. Car horns, hurried footsteps, the whir of newspaper stands opening their metal shutters. Luca barely noticed any of it. His world had shrunk to the precise dimensions of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. A small group of protesters had gathered near the building's entrance, their signs declaring grievances against corporate greed. Luca had learned long ago to look past such displays. Success required a certain thickness of skin, a careful cultivation of distance between oneself and the chaos of human need. That's when he saw her. The little girl stood apart from both the protesters and the steady stream of employees filing into the building. Her brown skin glowed warmly in the morning light, and her neat braids were tied with purple ribbons that had seen better days. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. What caught Luca's attention, despite his carefully maintained emotional barriers, was the way she held herself, straight-backed but uncertain, like a tiny bird gathering courage to sing. In her hands she clutched a notebook that had clearly been loved nearly to pieces. The cover was bent and taped, the spiral binding stretched and kinked. Something about that battered notebook tugged at a long-buried memory in Luca's mind, but he pushed the thought away. He had exactly 47 minutes until the board meeting. As he neared the entrance, the girl's eyes found his. There was a depth to them that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see straight through his expensive suit to the scared 8-year-old boy he'd once been. He quickened his pace slightly, aiming for the revolving door that would carry him safely into his controlled, predictable world. But then she stepped forward, and everything changed. Her voice was small but clear, carrying a melody that seemed to float above the city noise like a leaf on the wind. Just 2 words. Mama's song. The world stopped. Luca's feet refused to move. His briefcase suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Those 2 simple words, sung in that particular melody, crashed through 30 years of carefully constructed walls and defenses. He was 8 years old again, sitting on worn carpet while his mother's gentle voice filled their tiny apartment with hope. The same melody, the same words, her special way of telling him everything would be okay, even when the cupboards were bare and the rent was late. Mama's song, she'd called it, her secret spell against darkness. The morning sounds of the financial district faded away. The protesters' signs blurred. The board meeting, with all its high-stakes negotiations, seemed to exist in another universe entirely. Luca turned slowly to face the girl. She stood there, holding her notebook like a shield, but her eyes remained steady on his face. She saw the exact moment the recognition hit him, saw the careful mask of corporate indifference crumble away. The first tear caught him by surprise. It slid down his cheek before he could stop it, followed quickly by another. He hadn't cried in public since the day his mother disappeared, hadn't allowed himself to cry at all for so many years that the sensation felt foreign, almost painful. More tears came, and Luca Moretti, the man whose name graced the side of the building, whose net worth was calculated in billions, whose reputation for cold efficiency was legendary, stood rooted to the spot as emotion overwhelmed him. People stopped to stare. Phones came out to record the unexpected scene. The protesters fell silent, their signs lowering as they watched this strange tableau unfold. But Luca barely noticed any of it. His entire world had narrowed to this little girl and the echo of a song he thought he'd forgotten. His mother's song. Their private language of love and reassurance, now somehow carried in the voice of this child who couldn't possibly know what those notes meant. Yet she did know. Her eyes told him she understood exactly what she'd awakened in him. The carefully ordered numbers in his head scattered like autumn leaves in a storm. The precise schedule of his day shattered. All his years of building walls and maintaining control meant nothing in the face of those two sung words that reached across decades to touch the wounded heart of that abandoned 8-year-old boy. Tears continued to fall as he stared at the girl, his public armor lying in pieces around him on the busy sidewalk. In that moment, Luca Moretti was no longer the billionaire CEO, no longer the powerful figure whose mere presence made board members nervous. He was simply a son who had lost his mother, standing before a child who somehow knew the secret song that had died with her disappearance. The crowd around them grew, a circle of witnesses to this unprecedented display of vulnerability from a man known for his impenetrable composure. But the only person Luca saw was the small girl with the tattered notebook, whose voice had just changed everything. Luca's throat felt tight as he took a halting step toward the girl. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Would you say that again?" Alaya hugged her notebook closer, but didn't retreat. Instead, she closed her eyes and began to hum softly. The melody floated between them like a delicate thread connecting past to present. 4 simple notes that formed the beginning of a lullaby Luca hadn't heard in 30 years. His hands trembled. "Where did you learn that song?" Before Alaya could answer, a security guard appeared at Luca's elbow. "Sir, is everything all right? Should we escort this child away from the premises?" "No." Luca's sharp response made both the guard and Alaya jump. He softened his tone. "No, thank you, James. She's fine." He waved away his approaching assistant, who was tapping meaningfully at her watch. "Cancel my morning. All of it." The assistant's eyes widened. "But sir, the board meeting, cancel it." His voice left no room for argument, though his eyes never left Alaya's face. "Please, tell me about the song." Alaya shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I don't know all the words," she said quietly. "Just the beginning part. Miss Ruth taught it to me at the shelter." Miss Ruth? The name meant nothing to him, but hope flared in his chest. "Which shelter?" "The women's shelter on Oak Street. Miss Ruth works there. She's really old, but she remembers lots of songs." Alaya's voice grew more confident as she spoke about the elderly woman. "She says songs are like memories that never forget how to dance." A small crowd had gathered, watching the unlikely scene unfold, the powerful CEO in his tailored suit, crouching down to eye level with a young girl in well-worn clothes. His assistant hovered anxiously nearby, her phone buzzing with incoming messages about the abandoned board meeting. "Would you—" Luca paused, aware of how strange his request might sound. "Would you be willing to sit with me for a few minutes? There's a cafe just around the corner. We could talk about the song, about Miss Ruth." He glanced around, suddenly conscious of their public location. "Of course, we'd need to. Call the shelter first. Let them know where you are." Alaya nodded solemnly. "Miss Ruth knows I'm here. She said I might find you today." The simple statement sent a shiver down Luca's spine. He stood slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was this Miss Ruth, and how did she know his mother's private lullaby? His assistant approached again. Phone extended. "Sir, the board is demanding an explanation. They're threatening to call an emergency session to—" Luca took the phone, never breaking eye contact with Alaya. "Gerald? Yes, I understand the importance of today's meeting. Something urgent has come up. Family business. No, it can't wait." He listened for a moment to the angry voice on the other end. "You'll have my proxy statement within the hour. That's all I can offer right now." He ended the call and handed the phone back to his assistant, who looked like she might faint. In 15 years, Luca had never missed a board meeting. He had worked through flu, family funerals, and natural disasters. But now, watching Alaya clutch her notebook and wait patiently, he knew nothing else mattered. "Sarah," he addressed his assistant, "please call the women's shelter on Oak Street. Confirm that they know where—" He glanced at Alaya. "Alaya," she supplied. "Where Alaya is, and that she has permission to speak with me. Then have security clear my schedule for the day." The walk to the cafe took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like crossing a boundary into another world. Away from the towering glass buildings and suited crowds, they found a quiet corner table in the small establishment. Luca ordered hot chocolate for Alaya and coffee for himself, though his hands were shaking too much to consider drinking it. Sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The ordinary morning sounds, cups clinking, quiet conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine created a strange backdrop for the extraordinary moment unfolding between them. Alaya sat across from him, her feet dangling well above the floor, the notebook placed carefully on the table between them. Her eyes, wise beyond their years, studied him with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, almost like recognition. Sarah appeared briefly to confirm that the shelter had given permission for their conversation, then retreated to handle the chaos of Luca's abandoned schedule. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but he ignored it. The corporate empire he'd built, the deals worth millions that hung in the balance today, none of it seemed real anymore. What felt real was the echo of that lullaby, the way it had sliced through 3 decades of carefully maintained numbness. What felt real was this child who somehow knew a melody that had been a secret between mother and son, a private spell of comfort that disappeared along with her one ordinary Tuesday morning when he was 8 years old. Luca's coffee arrived, sending aromatic steam into the air between them. He watched as Alaya carefully wrapped her small hands around her hot chocolate mug, and in that ordinary gesture he saw the weight of what had just entered his life. Something sacred, a possible thread leading back to his mother. And something dangerous, because whatever truth lay at the end of that thread had been buried for 30 years, and some secrets don't stay buried without reason. The bell above the cafe door chimed as another customer entered, and Alaya looked up at the sound. The movement caught the light just right, and for a moment Luca saw his mother's gentle grace in the way the child held herself. It was impossible, of course. This girl couldn't have any real connection to his mother. Yet here she sat, carrying a piece of his most precious memory in her voice. His coffee cooled, untouched, as he gathered the courage to begin asking the questions that might change everything. Inside the cafe, the morning light softened as clouds drifted past the windows. Alaya's small hands remained wrapped around her hot chocolate, which had cooled enough for her to take careful sips. The whipped cream had left a tiny dot on her nose, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes held a wisdom that made Luca's chest ache. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror growing up, the look of a child who had grown up too fast. "Can you tell me how you learned the song?" Luca asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. Alaya set down her mug and smoothed the wrinkled pages of her notebook. "Miss Ruth taught it to me after Mama died," she said simply, though her lower lip trembled slightly. "I couldn't sleep at night, and Miss Ruth would sit with me. She has lots of songs she remembers from people who used to stay at the shelter." Luca leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "When did your mother pass away?" 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days ago." Alaya's fingers traced invisible patterns on the table's surface. "She was sick for a long time. We stayed in different places, but Miss Ruth's shelter was the last one. Mama liked it there because Miss Ruth remembered all the old stories." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of such profound loss struck Luca deeply. Here was a child who, like him, had learned to carry grief as if it were simply another part of daily life. "Miss Ruth said the song came from someone special," Alaya continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "A lady who used to sing on the streets. She would find the children who were sad or scared and sing to them until they felt better." Something shifted in Luca's chest, a memory breaking loose. His mother, kneeling beside a crying child outside a grocery store, singing softly until the tears stopped. He had forgotten that moment, buried it beneath years of corporate spreadsheets and board meetings. "This lady," he prompted carefully. "Did Miss Ruth tell you anything else about her?" Alaya nodded, taking another sip of hot chocolate. "She said the lady was different from other street musicians. She didn't play for money. She played for love. Miss Ruth said she wrote songs that were like—" She paused, concentrating on remembering the exact words. "Like medicine for broken hearts." Luca's hands gripped the edge of the table. That was exactly what his mother's music had been. Heart medicine. He remembered nights when the world felt too big, too scary, and her voice would wrap around him like a warm blanket, making everything manageable again. "But Miss Ruth said something happened," Alaya continued, her voice dropping lower. "The lady got in trouble because she was trying to protect something she made. Miss Ruth says she didn't run away. She disappeared because she had to." The words hit Luca like a physical blow. For 30 years, he had carried the story the world had given him, that his mother had abandoned him, unable to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. It was the story his father had told, the one the press had printed, the one that had shaped him into the hard-edged businessman he'd become. "What?" His voice cracked, and he had to start again. "What else did Miss Ruth tell you about why she disappeared?" Alaya shook her head. "She doesn't talk about it much. She gets sad and sometimes scared, but she keeps all the songs safe. She says that's what matters, keeping the songs alive until they find their way home." Luca looked at his watch, not really seeing the time. The world outside the cafe windows continued its usual rush, but inside their quiet corner, time seemed to move differently. He thought about his empty penthouse apartment, filled with expensive art that never touched his heart. He thought about his mother's music, surviving all these years in a shelter, being used to comfort other lost children. "Alaya," he said carefully, "would it be all right if I drove you back to the shelter? I'd like to meet Miss Ruth." The girl's face brightened. "She's usually in the garden this time of day." She says growing things helps her remember the good parts of sad stories. Luca signaled for the check, his mind already racing ahead. Somewhere in that shelter was a thread leading back to his mother, not the failure history had painted her to be, but the gentle soul he remembered, a woman who sang to troubled children, who disappeared protecting something precious, who had somehow known her songs would find their way back to him. As they stepped out of the cafe, Alaya slipped her small hand into his, natural as breathing. The trust in that simple gesture humbled him. He helped her into his car, making sure she was safely buckled in, and couldn't help but notice how out of place his sleek luxury vehicle looked parked on the modest street. Ms. Ruth says sometimes the best stories take the longest time to tell, Alaya said as they pulled away from the curb, because they have to wait for the right hearts to hear them. Luca adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. For the first time in decades, he saw more than the successful businessman he'd built himself into. He saw his mother's son, finally ready to hear the truth about why she disappeared. The shelter was only a few miles away, but with each block they drove, Luca felt himself moving further from the world he'd known, and closer to something both wonderful and terrifying. The possibility that everything he'd believed about his mother's disappearance had been wrong. The women's shelter stood like a tired sentinel among the condemned buildings, its faded brick facade telling stories of decades spent harboring those in need. As Luca parked his gleaming car along the crumbling curb, he felt the stark contrast between his world and this one. Paint peeled from window frames and makeshift repairs dotted the building's exterior, but carefully tended flowers pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. Small acts of defiance against urban decay. Alaya bounced out of the car, her energy transforming as she reached familiar ground. "Miss Ruth's garden is this way," she said, leading Luca around the side of the building. The narrow alley opened into a surprising oasis. Raised beds bursting with vegetables, herbs, and flowers created a maze of green life against the grey surroundings. An elderly black woman stood among the plants, her silver hair caught in the afternoon light. She turned at their approach, and Luca watched as recognition flickered across her face. Her hand flew to her chest, and she steadied herself against a nearby tomato cage. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Elena's boy." Luca felt his throat tighten at his mother's name. "You knew her?" Miss Ruth's eyes never left his face as she nodded slowly. "Knew her? Child, I helped keep her safe until—" She trailed off, glancing at Alaya. "Little one, would you check on Miss Carmen's cats for me? Make sure they have fresh water." Alaya looked between the adults, understanding passing across her young features. She squeezed Luca's hand once before heading inside, leaving them alone in the garden's relative privacy. "You look just like her," Miss Ruth said softly. "Same way of holding yourself, like you're carrying music inside that's too big for words." Luca stepped closer, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Miss Ruth, please. I've spent 30 years not knowing what happened to her. Alaya said you helped protect something my mother created?" The older woman's face grew serious. "Your mama was writing songs that told truth people didn't want told. Stories about women who'd been used up and thrown away by powerful men. Stories about children left behind. She was gathering them all, weaving them into something beautiful and dangerous." Miss Ruth moved to a wooden bench, gesturing for Luca to join her. When they realized what she was doing, they tried to silence her, but I helped her hide the writings, the songs. We scattered them like seeds, planted them in places they'd never think to look. "Who tried to silence her?" Luca asked, his voice rough with emotion. "The same kinds of men who always try to silence women who speak truth." Miss Ruth replied, "Men in suits who think money can buy the right to destroy lives." She fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Men who sit on boards and sign papers that tear down shelters like this one without ever looking at the faces of those they're hurting. Luca felt cold despite the afternoon warmth. What do you mean? This shelter. Miss Ruth gestured to the building behind them. Has been here for 40 years. Now some corporations bought up the whole block for urban renewal. They're going to tear it all down, build luxury condos or some such nonsense. She shook her head. 3 months' notice they gave us. 3 months to find new places for women who've got nowhere else to go. The cold in Luca's chest spread as realization dawned. He knew exactly which corporation she was talking about, his own. The acquisition had been a minor line item in last quarter's reports, just another property deal in a portfolio of hundreds. Miss Ruth? He started, but she held up a hand. I know who you are, Luca Moretti. Your name's been in the papers plenty, and I know digging into this past will make powerful people mighty uncomfortable. The same folks who benefited from your mama's silence back then are still pulling strings today. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small key. But your mama believed truth was worth any price. These belonged to her. I've been keeping them safe, waiting for the right time. The key was attached to a faded ribbon. Second floor, room 212, she said quietly. It's where she stayed. Some things are still there, hidden where they never thought to look. Luca stared at the key in his palm, its weight far greater than its size would suggest. In the distance, he could hear Elia's voice floating through an open window, singing something soft and sweet to the cats. They'll come after the shelter harder if you start asking questions, Miss Ruth warned. Are you ready for that fight? Before Luca could answer, his phone buzzed. The board was demanding an emergency meeting about his missed morning session. His own company, his own wealth, was actively threatening to destroy this place that had preserved his mother's legacy, protected her secrets, and now sheltered a child who somehow knew her songs. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the garden, Luca stood alone outside the shelter. The key pressed into his palm like a burning coal. Through the windows he could see women preparing dinner, children doing homework, a community supporting each other in a building his signature could condemn. The conflict was no longer abstract figures on a spreadsheet. It was faces, stories, and somewhere inside, his mother's hidden truth. His phone buzzed again. The board was waiting. In his other hand, he held his mother's key. The choice between them had never felt more stark, or more important. The drive back to his penthouse felt longer than usual. Luca's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. The city lights blurred past his windows, but his mind kept returning to the shelter, to Miss Ruth's weathered face, to Elia's gentle singing, to the key that now felt heavy in his pocket. Inside his sleek apartment, everything looked different. The minimalist furniture and stark white walls that had once represented success now felt cold, empty. He paced the length of his living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city he'd helped shape. For better or worse. Luca loosened his tie and sank into his leather armchair. The notebook from his breast pocket, the one where he'd scribbled what Elia had told him about the song, lay open on the glass coffee table. His mother's lullaby. He could still hear it, clear as yesterday, her voice soft and warm as she tucked him into bed. "My little lion," she would whisper, brave and strong. Sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Miss Ruth's knowing gaze, heard her words about men in suits who destroyed lives with signatures. His own signature. How many other communities had he affected without even knowing? How many lives had he impacted while focusing only on profit margins and quarterly reports? At 3 o'clock in the morning, he found himself in his home office, poring over acquisition documents. The shelter property was part of a larger development deal worth millions. His executives had praised it as a strategic urban renewal initiative. Now those sterile words made his stomach turn. By 5 o'clock, he had made up his mind. He sent an urgent email to his legal team requesting an emergency meeting at 7:30. His phone immediately lit up with concerned responses, but he ignored them all. The morning sun was just breaking over the horizon when Luca arrived at his office tower. He'd chosen his armor carefully today, his most expensive suit, his power tie. He would need every advantage. The conference room filled quickly with confused executives and legal advisors. Their murmurs died down as Luca stood at the head of the table. "I'm freezing the West Side Development Project," he announced without preamble, effective immediately. The room erupted. His CFO, Margaret Chen, spoke first. "Luca, we've already invested millions in preliminary work. The shareholders will have to wait." Luca cut in, his voice firm. "There's a women's shelter in that development zone. We're not touching it." "A shelter?" Thomas Reed, head of acquisitions, scoffed. "We can relocate them. Offer compensation." "No." Luca's palm hit the table, the sound sharp in the suddenly quiet room. "That shelter stays exactly where it is. I want our legal team to draw up protection measures, and I want a proposal for how we can develop around it while ensuring its long-term survival." "This is unprecedented," Margaret protested. "The board will never—" "The board doesn't make this decision. I do." Luca straightened to his full height. "And I've made it. Get it done." He left them sitting there, mouths agape, and headed to his private office. His assistant trailed behind him, tablet in hand, rattling off the day's schedule. Luca held up a hand to stop her. "Clear my afternoon," he said, "and have accounting prepare an emergency fund transfer. I need supplies delivered to this address." He scribbled down the shelter's location. Later that day, Luca pulled up to the shelter in his car, watching as workers unloaded boxes of necessities, toiletries, blankets, non-perishable food. Miss Ruth stood on the front steps, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "This isn't a permanent solution," Luca told her as he approached. "But it buys us time to find one. The development project is frozen, and I'm working on legal protection for the shelter." Miss Ruth's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your mama would be proud," she said softly. A small figure appeared in the doorway, Alaya clutching her notebook. She moved down the steps slowly, almost shyly, and stopped in front of Luca. Without a word, she opened her notebook and began to sing. The lullaby floated out, pure and clear in the afternoon air, just a fragment but enough to make Luca's heart ache. He knelt down to meet her eyes, finding in them a wisdom far beyond her years. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for bringing her song back to me. Will you help us find the rest?" Alaya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca nodded solemnly. "I promise I'll find the truth about what happened. All of it." He meant every word, even as Miss Ruth's warning echoed in his mind. He had no idea how much that promise would cost him, what forces he would have to face. But looking into Alaya's hopeful eyes, he knew it didn't matter. Some promises were worth any price. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of Luca's office as he scrolled through his carefully vetted list of private investigators. After 3 hours of background checks and phone calls, he'd finally found someone who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Daniel Martinez, a former financial crimes detective with 20 years of experience. "I need absolute discretion," Luca explained, pacing behind his desk as Martinez sat calmly in one of the leather chairs. "This investigation involves my mother's disappearance and potentially some powerful people in the music industry." Martinez nodded, his weathered face serious. "I understand, Mr. Moretti. No publicity, no leaks, just facts and evidence." "Whatever it costs," Luca added, stopping to look out over the city. I need to know what happened to her." For the next several hours, they combed through what little Luca knew. His mother's name, Elena Moretti, her history as a street musician, the approximate date of her disappearance. It wasn't much to go on, but Martinez seemed undaunted. "I'll start with the music licensing records from that period," he said, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Street performers sometimes got picked up by talent scouts. If she signed any contracts, there'll be a paper trail. While Martinez began his investigation, Luca immersed himself in his own research. He had his assistant pull every contract and settlement agreement from the past 30 years that involved music rights. The boxes filled an entire conference room, and he spent hours there each day, reading through endless legal documents. In the afternoons, though, he found himself drawn to the shelter. Alaya attended classes in a converted dining room, part of the shelter's small but determined education program. She would look up from her books when he arrived, offering a small wave before returning to her work. "She's very bright," Miss Ruth told him one day as they watched Alaya working on her math homework. "Especially with music. She can hear a song once and remember it perfectly." Luca nodded, thinking of his mother. She used to say music was like a photograph for your ears. It captures a moment perfectly. After school hours, Luca would often sit with Alaya in the shelter's small courtyard. Sometimes they talked about simple things, her favorite subjects in school, the books she was reading. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, both understanding the weight of loss they carried. "Did your mama sing to you a lot?" Alaya asked one evening, as they shared a packet of cookies he'd brought. "Every night," Luca replied softly. "Even when we barely had enough to eat, she always had a song." Alaya nodded sagely. "My mama, too. She said songs are like hugs that last forever." These quiet moments with Alaya began to heal something in Luca he hadn't even known was broken. The cold, efficient businessman was slowly remembering how to feel, how to care about something beyond profit margins and stock prices. Meanwhile, Martinez worked tirelessly, following leads and digging through decades-old records. 3 weeks into the investigation, he requested an urgent meeting. "I found something," he said, spreading documents across Luca's desk. "Your mother's music, 3 of her original songs, they appear in a catalogue owned by Golden Age Productions." Luca leaned forward, scanning the paperwork. "I've never heard of them." "They were big in the 1980s and 90s. Martinez explained. "Owned by Victor Romano. He's retired now, lives in a mansion up in the hills. But here's the interesting part. The songs were registered in 1994, the same year your mother disappeared." Luca's hands tightened on the edge of his desk. "How is that possible? She was a street performer. How did her songs end up in a professional catalogue?" Martinez's expression grew grave. "That's where it gets concerning. The paperwork is perfect. Too perfect. Every signature, every date, everything filed exactly right. In my experience, that usually means someone went back later and cleaned things up, made them look legitimate." "Can we prove it?" "Not yet, but I found something else." Martinez pulled out another document. Golden Age Productions had a pattern. They'd find talented street musicians, promising them deals. But the contracts were predatory. The artists would sign away all their rights, usually for a fraction of what their music was worth. Luca felt sick. He remembered his mother's gentle nature, how trusting she had been. She would have been an easy target. "There's more," Martinez continued. "Several artists who worked with Golden Age disappeared after filing complaints. Official records show they moved away, but I can't find any trace of them after that." The implications hung heavy in the air. Luca thought of his mother's sudden vanishing, how thoroughly she had disappeared. Had she discovered something? Threatened to expose someone? "I need everything you can find on Victor Romano." Luca said, his voice hard. Every business deal, every lawsuit, every connection he has. Martinez nodded, gathering his papers. I'm already on it. But Mr. Moretti, these people, they had enough power to make people disappear 30 years ago. They might still have that power today. I don't care, Luca replied. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I need to know the truth. That evening, Luca visited the shelter again. Alaya was practicing a new song she'd learned in music class, her clear voice carrying across the courtyard. He sat quietly, listening, thinking of his mother singing on street corners, her talent noticed by the wrong people. Alaya finished her song and came to sit beside him. You look sad, she observed. Just thinking, he said, managing a small smile. About my mother's songs, and how important it is to protect the people who make beautiful things. Alaya nodded solemnly. Miss Ruth says that's what your mama tried to do. Protect people. Is that why she had to go away? Maybe. Luca answered honestly. I'm trying to find out. Will you tell me when you do? Alaya asked, her dark eyes serious. I think her songs are important. They feel important when I sing them. I promise, Luca said, and meant it. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Luca thought about the document sitting on his desk. The first real clue to his mother's disappearance. Somewhere in those perfectly filed papers and clean signatures lay an ugly truth, one that powerful people had tried to bury. But for his mother's sake, for Alaya's sake, he would uncover it, no matter the cost. The shelter's basement was a maze of cardboard boxes and forgotten furniture, lit by a single flickering bulb. Miss Ruth moved slowly, between the stacks, her arthritis making each step deliberate. Luca followed behind her, ducking beneath low-hanging pipes. Most folks don't know this space exists, Miss Ruth said, her voice echoing slightly. Been using it to store things for 30 years now. Some women leave things behind when they move on. Some... She paused, adjusting her glasses. Some never come back for what they left. Luca's throat tightened. He knew which category his mother fell into. Here, Miss Ruth said, stopping before a stack of boxes in the far corner. These have been here since before your mama disappeared. I never had the heart to throw them away. The boxes were water-stained and soft with age. Luca knelt beside them, his expensive suit collecting dust. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the first box. Inside were papers, dozens of them, sheet music written in familiar handwriting, the notes carefully drawn, song lyrics scribbled on napkins and the backs of receipts. His mother's creativity had spilled onto any surface she could find. She was always writing, Miss Ruth said softly. Even when she had nothing else, she had her songs. Luca lifted the papers carefully, reading lyrics that spoke of hope, of love, of the dream of a better world. His mother's heart was preserved in these words, her gentle spirit captured in verses about helping others and finding beauty in dark places. Here, Miss Ruth said, reaching past him to pull something from the bottom of the box. This might interest you most. She held out a cassette tape, its case cracked at one corner. The label was faded, but still legible. For my son, written in his mother's flowing script. Luca stared at it, his vision blurring. I never knew this existed. She made it just before... Miss Ruth trailed off, shaking her head. She was worried, those last few weeks. Said people were following her, watching the shelter. She gave me this tape and made me promise to keep it safe. Luca turned the tape over in his hands. Why didn't you try to find me? To give it to me? Miss Ruth's face showed ancient regret. Your mama made me promise not to. Said it wasn't safe. That the wrong people were watching you too. All these years I've honored that promise. But now, she gestured to the basement around them, maybe it's time for promises to give way to truth. They spent the next hour sorting through the boxes. Each item they uncovered was a piece of the puzzle. Notebooks filled with half-finished songs, letters never sent, and newspaper clippings about music industry lawsuits that his mother had collected. She was building a case. Luca realized, reading through the articles. She was gathering evidence against someone. That's what I figured too, Miss Ruth agreed. But whatever she found, it was dangerous enough to make her run. Finally, when they had examined everything, Luca carefully packed the most important items into a smaller box. The tape he placed in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. "Thank you," he said to Miss Ruth, "for keeping these safe all these years." She patted his arm. "Your mama was a light in this world, Mr. Moretti. Don't let anyone dim her memory." Later that night, Luca sat in his parked car outside his penthouse, the tape in his hands. His expensive car stereo didn't have a cassette player. Who did these days? But he'd stopped at an electronics store on the way home and bought a portable player, the kind he'd had as a teenager. His hands shook as he inserted the tape. For a moment, there was only static. Then, "Luca, my sweet boy." His mother's voice filled the car, clear and beautiful despite the tape's age. Tears spilled down his face immediately, years of locked-away grief breaking free at the sound. "If you're listening to this, then something has happened to me. But I need you to know, everything I did, every choice I made, was to protect you. These people, they don't just steal music. They steal lives. They destroy families. I couldn't let them hurt you." Luca pressed his hands to his face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs as his mother's voice continued. "I'm recording these songs for you. Songs they can never steal because they live in your heart. Remember how we used to sing together? Remember the lullaby that was just for us?" Then she began to sing, and Luca was 8 years old again, safe in his mother's arms as she sang him to sleep. The same melody Alaya had sung outside his tower, preserved perfectly on this aging tape. "Never doubt that I love you, my darling boy. Never doubt that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. But sometimes love means protecting people, even when it breaks your heart." The tape continued, filled with songs and messages of love, his mother's voice a balm for wounds he'd carried for decades. Luca sat in his car until dawn, listening to it over and over, letting himself feel everything he'd locked away for so long. As the sun rose over the city, Luca's grief crystallized into determination. His mother had sacrificed everything to protect him from powerful people who stole more than just music. Now it was his turn to protect her legacy, to expose the truth she'd died trying to reveal. Whatever it cost him, his reputation, his company, even his safety, he would find justice for his mother. He owed her that much. He owed it to Alaya, who carried his mother's songs forward. He owed it to Miss Ruth, who had guarded these secrets for so long. Wiping his eyes, Luca started his car. The tape's final song played softly as he drove toward his office, his mother's voice carrying him forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning after discovering the tape, Luca arrived at the shelter just as breakfast was being served. The old dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as women and children gathered around worn tables. Alaya sat alone, stirring her cereal with mechanical precision, lost in thought. "Is this seat taken?" Luca asked, softly. Alaya's face brightened. "You came back." "I promised I would." He set his briefcase down and settled into the metal folding chair. "How are you this morning?" "I have a math test today," she admitted, her spoon clinking against the bowl. "I'm not very good at fractions." Luca glanced at his watch. His first meeting wasn't for 2 hours. "Would you like some help reviewing?" For the next 45 minutes, they worked through practice problems using pieces of toast to demonstrate parts and wholes. Alaya's understanding grew with each example, her confidence building slowly but surely. "See, you've got this," Luca encouraged as she solved the final problem correctly. "Just remember, fractions are just pieces of a whole, like notes in a song." Alaya's eyes lit up at the musical comparison. "Is that how your mama taught you math?" The question caught him off guard. Yes, actually. She used to turn everything into songs." The memory surfaced gently, without the usual sting. She called multiplication number dancing. "That's pretty," Alaya said. She gathered her backpack, then hesitated. "Will you be here after school?" "I'll pick you up myself," Luca promised. "We can work on your homework together." Throughout that day, between meetings and calls, Luca found his thoughts drifting to Alaya's test. At 3 o'clock sharp, he waited outside her school, feeling strangely nervous among the other parents and caregivers. Alaya emerged from the building, scanning the crowd. When she spotted him, her whole body relaxed with visible relief. She rushed over, waving a paper in her hand. "I got a B+, she announced, showing him the test. "The fraction questions were the easiest part." "I knew you could do it." Luca felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Pride, he realized. Pride in someone else's achievement. That evening, they sat at a quiet corner table in the shelter's dining room. Other children occasionally waved to Alaya, but seemed to sense she preferred her space. As they worked through her spelling homework, Miss Ruth brought them both bowls of soup. "Your mother used to sit right there," Miss Ruth told Luca, nodding at his chair. "She'd help the children with their schoolwork too, when she could." Luca looked down at the scarred table surface, wondering if his mother's hands had traced these same patterns in the wood grain. The next morning established a pattern. Luca would arrive for breakfast, help Alaya prepare for school, then return for afternoon pickup and homework help. His assistant rearranged his schedule without comment, though Luca caught the slight smile on her face when he blocked out school pickup as a recurring appointment. During Wednesday's breakfast, Alaya said grace before eating, her small hands folded carefully. Luca watched, fascinated by her easy faith. "Would you like to pray too?" she asked, opening one eye. "I don't really know how," he admitted. "It's just talking to God," she explained. "Like talking to a friend who always listens." "Do you think he listens to everyone?" Alaya nodded solemnly. "Even people who don't think he's listening. That's what Mama taught me before she went to heaven." The simple certainty in her voice stirred something in Luca's chest. When was the last time he'd believed in anything with such pure conviction? On Thursday afternoon, they sat in the shelter's small courtyard, enjoying rare autumn sunshine while Alaya practiced her reading aloud. She stumbled over a difficult word, frustration creeping into her voice. "Take your time," Luca encouraged. "Break it down into pieces like we did with fractions." She tried again, sounding it out carefully. "Perseverance?" "Perfect. Do you know what that word means?" Alaya thought for a moment. "Is it like not giving up?" "Exactly. It means keeping going even when things are hard. Like you," she said. "You're persevering to find out about your mama." Her insight stopped him cold. Here was this child, seeing straight through to his core with the clarity only innocence could provide. Friday evening found them sharing dinner with several other shelter residents. Alaya led the prayer, her voice clear and sweet in the humble space. Luca noticed how the other children looked up to her, despite, or perhaps because of, her quiet nature. After the meal, as other families cleared their plates, Alaya turned to him with unexpected seriousness. "Do you believe in miracles, Mr. Luca?" The question hung in the air between them, Luca thought about the tape hidden in his briefcase, about his mother's voice preserved across decades. He thought about this child who somehow knew his mother's song, who had drawn him out of his tower and back into the messy, beautiful world of human connection. He opened his mouth to answer, but found he couldn't. Not yet. The truth was, he didn't know any more what he believed. His carefully constructed worldview of cold facts and bottom lines had been crumbling ever since Alaya first sang those two words outside his building. She waited patiently for his response, her dark eyes full of wisdom beyond her years. In them, Luca saw his own questions reflected back at him, about faith, about purpose, about the invisible threads that connected people across time and space. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. The autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Luca's office, casting long shadows across his desk. He sat reviewing the shelter's funding proposal when his assistant burst in, face drawn with worry. "Mr. Moretti, the board has called an emergency meeting. They're waiting in the main conference room." Luca glanced at his watch. 2:15 in the afternoon. His heart sank. He'd planned to pick up Alaya from school at 3 o'clock. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes," he said, already reaching for his phone to text Miss Ruth about the delay. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Through the glass walls, he could see 12 stern faces around the massive oak table. Chairman Reynolds, a man whose silver hair matched the steel in his eyes, sat at the head. Luca straightened his tie and pushed open the heavy door. Silence fell immediately. "Gentlemen, ladies." He nodded, taking his seat. "What's so urgent it couldn't wait for our scheduled meeting next week?" Chairman Reynolds cleared his throat. "Luca, we've been patient, but your recent decisions are causing serious concern among our shareholders." Patricia Chen, head of acquisitions, slid a folder across the table. "The shelter property delay alone has cost us $8 million in potential revenue. Our competitors are already circling. That shelter serves hundreds of vulnerable women and children." Luca countered, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "Surely we can find a way to—" "This isn't about charity." Reynolds cut in. "It's about fiduciary responsibility. Your personal involvement with this shelter is compromising your judgment." Another board member, James Wilson, leaned forward. "We've also noticed you've hired private investigators, accessing sealed corporate records from the 1980s. Care to explain?" Luca's stomach clenched. They'd been watching him more closely than he'd realized. "Those records may contain evidence of historical wrongdoing that the company needs to address," he said carefully. "Historical wrongdoing?" Reynolds's laugh was sharp. "You're digging into ancient history while our stock price drops? This obsession with your mother's past needs to stop." Luca felt the blood drain from his face. "They knew. Of course they knew." Patricia spoke again, her tone gentler but no less firm. "We're prepared to offer you a choice, Luca. Either proceed with the acquisition as planned or step down as CEO." "You can't be serious." But looking around the table, he saw no allies. The board has already taken a preliminary vote. Reynolds said, "You have 48 hours to make your decision." Luca's phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Miss Ruth confirming she could pick up Alaya. He started to reach for it, but Reynolds wasn't finished. "One more thing. Your recent financial support of the shelter? It's being scrutinized by regulatory compliance. Corporate funds cannot be used for personal projects." "Personal projects?" Luca's voice rose slightly. "That shelter is the only home some of those children have. Then I suggest you find them new homes." Reynolds replied coldly. "Quickly." The meeting dragged on for another hour, each minute feeling like a blade against Luca's skin. When he finally escaped, he had 4 missed calls from Miss Ruth. His hands shook as he dialed her number. "Luca?" Miss Ruth's voice was thick with tears. "Where have you been? They came for her." "What? Who came for who?" "Child services. They said with the shelter's funding uncertain, they had to move Alaya to a foster home immediately. The world tilted sideways. Luca grabbed the wall for support. When? About 30 minutes ago. I tried to stop them to say you were coming, but they had all the paperwork in order. Luca was already running for the elevator. Which direction did they go? Which agency? Downtown office, I think. Luca, she was so scared. She kept asking for you. The elevator seemed to crawl between floors. Luca punched the lobby button repeatedly, as if that would make it move faster. I'm on my way. Keep trying to reach the caseworker. Tell them I'm coming. He burst out of the building and into the street, not bothering to wait for his driver. He sprinted the 6 blocks to the shelter, dodging pedestrians and ignoring the strange looks. But when he arrived, breathing hard, the shelter's front room was quiet. Miss Ruth sat alone at the intake desk, holding Alaya's worn notebook. They wouldn't even let her pack properly. Miss Ruth said softly. Said they had everything she needed at the foster home. Luca stared at the empty chair, where Alaya usually did her homework. Her half-finished math worksheet still lay on the table, pencil placed carefully parallel to the edge, just as he'd taught her. This is my fault, he whispered. I should have been here. Miss Ruth stood and placed the notebook in his hands. She left this for you. Said it was important you have it. Luca opened it with trembling fingers. On the last page, in Alaya's careful handwriting, were the words to his mother's lullaby, as much as she could remember. Below it, she'd written, "Sometimes miracles take time." But standing in the shelter's fading afternoon light, watching Miss Ruth wipe tears from her weathered cheeks, Luca wasn't sure they had time left to wait for miracles. The city lights blurred through Luca's windshield as he drove aimlessly through the darkening streets. He couldn't face going home to his empty penthouse, not with Alaya's notebook sitting heavy in his jacket pocket. Every traffic light seemed to mock him with its red glow, forcing him to stop and sit with his failure. Finally, he pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, but couldn't bring himself to leave the car. Instead, he reached for the damaged cassette tape they'd found beneath the shelter. His hands shook as he pushed it into the car's retrofitted player. Static crackled, then cleared. His mother's voice filled the space, as warm and gentle as he remembered. "My dearest Luca," Elena Moretti began, her voice catching. "If you're listening to this, then something has happened to me. But first, I need you to know. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every day without you has been like walking with half my heart missing." Luca pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, tears falling freely now. "They came to me with contracts," his mother continued. "Said my music would make millions. I was so excited to give you the life you deserved. But then I discovered what they were really doing. Stealing songs from street musicians, exploiting people who had no power to fight back. When I threatened to expose them..." She paused, her breath shaky. "Well, they made it clear what would happen to you if I didn't disappear." A sob tore from Luca's throat. All these years, he'd believed she'd abandoned him for her music career. The truth was exactly the opposite. "But here's what I need you to understand, my sweet boy." Elena's voice grew stronger. "Fear is the opposite of love. They used my fear to control me, to silence me. Don't let fear control you, Luca. Choose love. It's always the braver choice." The tape continued with the lullaby, their special song, but Luca could barely hear it through his weeping. He'd spent decades building walls around his heart, turning himself into the kind of man who could sit in boardrooms and calmly discuss destroying people's homes. He'd become exactly what his mother had fought against. His phone buzzed, displaying the investigator's number. Luca almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Mr. Moretti." The investigator's usual professional tone had an edge of urgency. I've found something you need to see. Now." 20 minutes later, Luca sat in a 24-hour diner, staring at documents spread across the sticky table. The investigator spoke in low tones, pointing to highlighted sections. "Your mother wasn't the only one they silenced. There were dozens of artists, mostly immigrants and homeless musicians. The company, your company now, built its early music division by stealing their work. The settlements were buried in shell corporations, but the money trail is clear." Luca's coffee grew cold as he read through the evidence. Names, dates, amounts paid to keep people quiet. His inherited fortune was built on stolen songs and broken lives. "This producer, Thomas Reynolds Sr., any relation to your current board member?" "His father," Luca whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "No wonder Reynolds Jr. is so desperate to stop the investigation." The investigator nodded. "There's more. The shelter property, it's not just about real estate. That location holds physical evidence. Original recordings, contracts, proof of the whole scheme. They're not trying to demolish a shelter. They're trying to bury evidence." Luca thought of Miss Ruth's warnings, of Eliah's simple faith that everything happened for a reason. Had God really brought this child into his life to help him uncover the truth? He pulled out Eliah's notebook, running his fingers over her careful handwriting. The words of his mother's lullaby stared back at him, but it was Eliah's message that pierced his heart. Sometimes miracles take time. "What are my options?" he asked the investigator. "Legally, you could fight the board, but they'll bury you in litigation. These people have spent decades protecting this secret. They won't stop now." Luca closed the notebook gently. "And if I go public? You'd be exposing yourself too. This could cost you everything, your position, your reputation, most of your inheritance. But it would force them to back off the shelter." The investigator leaned back, studying Luca carefully. "Potentially. It would certainly create enough public pressure to halt any development plans. But Mr. Moretti, we're talking about financial suicide here." Luca thought about Eliah's face when they'd taken her away, about his mother, choosing exile to protect him, about all the nameless artists whose songs had been stolen to build his fortune. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Fear is the opposite of love. For the first time since that morning's board meeting, Luca felt clarity cutting through his despair. He'd spent his whole life trying to control everything around him, thinking power and money could protect him from ever feeling as helpless as he had when his mother disappeared. But real strength, he was finally beginning to understand, wasn't about control at all. It was about having the courage to let go of everything you thought you needed, to choose love even when it cost you everything. He gathered the documents carefully, including them with Eliah's notebook. "Set up a press conference," he told the investigator. "First thing tomorrow morning. It's time to tell the whole story." "You're sure about this?" Luca's hand rested on the notebook, feeling the indentations of Eliah's writing beneath his fingers. "My mother sacrificed everything to protect me. Now it's my turn to protect what matters, not my bank account, but the truth, the shelter, Eliah." Looking down at the evidence of decades of exploitation and cover-ups, Luca finally understood that redemption wasn't something you could buy or control. Sometimes it required losing everything you thought made you strong to find a different kind of strength altogether. The morning dawned cold and grey over the city's financial district. Camera crews had already gathered outside the Moretti Tower, their equipment glistening with early morning dew. Inside his office, Luca stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the crowd grow larger with each passing minute. His assistant, Maria, knocked softly before entering. "Sir, the press conference is set for 9 o'clock. Your legal team strongly advises against this." Luca nodded, his reflection grave in the window glass. "Thank you, Maria. Please make sure everyone receives copies of the documentation packets we prepared." She hesitated. The board members are demanding an emergency meeting before the press conference. No, Luca said firmly. They've had decades to do the right thing. They don't get another chance to bury this. At precisely 9 o'clock, Luca walked onto the small stage set up in the tower's main lobby. Camera flashes exploded around him as reporters jostled for position. The familiar corporate logo loomed behind him, the same logo that had represented power and success, for so long now felt like a weight on his shoulders. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Today I am stepping down temporarily as Chief Executive Officer of Moretti International." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Cameras clicked frantically. From the back of the room, Luca could see Thomas Reynolds Jr.'s face turning purple with rage. "Furthermore, I am releasing evidence of systematic exploitation and fraud perpetrated by former executives of this company, specifically regarding the music division's early years under Thomas Reynolds Sr." Luca held up a thick folder. "In these documents, you will find evidence of how vulnerable artists, primarily immigrants and homeless musicians, were systematically deprived of their intellectual property rights. Their music was stolen, their voices silenced through predatory contracts and forced settlements." He paused, his throat tight. "Among these artists was my mother, Elena Moretti." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the story, or thought they did, of how Elena Moretti had abandoned her son and disappeared. It was part of Luca's legend, the abandoned boy who built an empire. "My mother didn't abandon me," Luca continued, his voice growing stronger. "She was forced into hiding to protect both her work and her child. The truth has been buried under legal threats and corporate power for too long." He gestured to his assistant, who began distributing packets to the journalists. "You'll find all the evidence here: original contracts, correspondence, banking records showing payments through shell companies, and testimony from survivors of this exploitation." Reynolds Jr. pushed through the crowd, his face contorted with fury. "This is corporate suicide, Moretti. You'll destroy everything." Luca met his gaze calmly. "No, Mr. Reynolds, I'm finally building something worth having." The next hours passed in a blur of questions, camera flashes, and legal threats. By noon, Moretti International's stock had plummeted. By 2 o'clock, 3 separate lawsuits had been filed against Luca personally. By 4 o'clock, Moral Moretti was trending worldwide, with artists and activists rallying behind his decision. As evening fell, Luca sat alone in his office, watching news coverage scroll across his multiple screens. His phone hadn't stopped ringing all day. Lawyers, board members, journalists, old friends suddenly concerned about his mental health. He thought about Elia, somewhere in the foster care system, probably watching this unfold on television. He thought about Miss Ruth and the shelter residents, wondering if he'd done enough to protect them. He thought about his mother, forced to choose between her art and her child. For the first time since childhood, Luca felt the weight of something greater than himself pressing down on his heart. He wasn't just tired, he was empty, scraped clean of all the protective layers he'd built around himself over the years. Slowly, almost without realizing what he was doing, Luca slid from his expensive leather chair onto his knees. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows as tears began rolling down his cheeks. "God," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if you're listening. I don't even know if I'm doing this right." He paused, swallowing hard. "But Elia believes in you. My mother did too. And I need help." His shoulders shook as years of carefully controlled emotion broke free. "Please," he prayed, "help me find the strength to see this through. Help me protect the shelter, find Elia, make this right. I've spent my whole life thinking I could control everything, fix everything with money and power. But I can't. I can't do this alone." The words came easier now, flowing from a place deep inside he'd kept locked away since he was 8 years old. And if you're really there, please tell my mother I finally understand. I understand why she had to leave, and I'm trying to be as brave as she was. Luca remained on his knees as the sky darkened outside, praying words he didn't know he had inside him, finally allowing himself to be truly vulnerable. In the emptiness of his luxurious office, stripped of his title and risking his fortune, Luca Moretti found something he'd been missing his entire adult life: the courage to be small, to be human, to need help. The city continued its endless rhythm below, unaware that one of its most powerful men was on his knees, learning to hope again. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds in Miss Ruth's modest office at the shelter. Luca sat across from her desk, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled from a sleepless night. Dark circles ringed his eyes, but there was a new determination in his gaze. "I've been calling everyone I know in social services," Miss Ruth said, shuffling through a stack of papers. Her weathered hands moved with purpose despite their arthritis. "The system's complicated, but Alaya's caseworker seems receptive. She's concerned about all the media attention, though." Luca leaned forward, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what they need." Miss Ruth studied him over her reading glasses. "They need to see stability, Luca. Not just financial, though that matters, but emotional stability. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Being a guardian isn't like visiting when it's convenient." "I know," Luca said softly. "But Alaya, she brought my mother's song back to me. She helped me find my conscience again. I can't just walk away." Miss Ruth nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. "That child has a way of reaching people's hearts, but the system will scrutinize everything: your work situation, your home environment, your support network." "My resignation is temporary," Luca explained. "Once the legal issues are settled, I'll still have more than enough resources. And I'm looking at houses outside the city, somewhere with a yard, good schools." "And what about emotional support?" Miss Ruth pressed. "Children who've experienced loss need consistency, community." Luca met her eyes. "That's why I'm hoping you'll help. You're the closest thing to family Alaya has right now. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I just want to give her a stable home and maybe heal something in both of us." Miss Ruth's expression softened. She reached across the desk and patted his hand. "I'll make some calls. The caseworker should be here within the hour." The wait seemed endless. Luca paced the small office, pausing occasionally to stare out at the shelter's tiny courtyard where he'd first heard his mother's song again. Finally, a sharp knock announced the arrival of the caseworker. She was younger than Luca expected, but her eyes held the weary knowledge of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen and got straight to business. "Mr. Moretti, I've reviewed your initial petition," she began, settling into the chair beside him. "Your financial resources are obviously not in question, despite recent events. But I have concerns about the timing and circumstances of this request." Luca nodded. "I understand. This isn't a publicity move or an impulse decision. Alaya and we share a unique connection through my mother's music. She helped me confront truths I'd been avoiding for decades." "Tell me about your support system," Sarah prompted. "Childcare plans, family, friends?" "I'm reorganizing my work life to be more present," Luca explained. "Miss Ruth has agreed to help with after-school care if needed. I'm looking at homes near good schools, and I'm in therapy now, dealing with my own childhood trauma." Sarah made notes, her expression neutral. "And what about Alaya's cultural needs, her connection to her own heritage?" "I want to honor and support every part of who she is," Luca said firmly. I'm not trying to remake her in my image. I want to give her room to grow into herself with all the support and opportunities I can provide. The questioning continued for over an hour. Sarah was thorough, pressing him on everything from his daily schedule to his plans for maintaining Alea's relationships with her shelter community. Miss Ruth occasionally added her own observations, describing how she'd watched Luca and Alea's bond develop. Finally, Sarah closed her notebook. I'll need to conduct a home study once you've secured appropriate housing, but based on our conversation and Miss Ruth's recommendation, I'm willing to arrange a supervised visit with Alea. Luca's heart leaped. When? Tomorrow afternoon. Her current foster family has been notified of your petition. They're temporary placement specialists, very experienced with transitions. The next 24 hours crawled by. Luca barely slept, alternating between anxiety and hope. When he arrived at the family services office the next day, his hands were shaking slightly. The meeting room was painted in cheerful colors, with comfortable furniture and toys scattered about, designed to put children at ease. Luca sat perched on the edge of a blue couch, waiting. When the door opened, his breath caught. Alea stood there, looking smaller than he remembered in her neat school uniform. Her eyes were cautious, searching his face. "Hello, Alea," he said softly. She took a few steps forward, her hands clasped together. "I saw you on TV," she said quietly. "You told everyone about your mama's song." Luca nodded, fighting back tears. "I did. It was time for the truth to come out. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them from moving you from the shelter." Alea moved closer, settling into an armchair near him. Sarah and the foster mother watched from near the door. "Miss Ruth says you want me to come live with you." "Only if you want to," Luca assured her. "I know it's a big change, but I promise to take care of you, to give you a good home, and to always keep your mother's memory alive along with mine." Alea studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes wise beyond her years. Then, very softly, she began to hum. The familiar melody of his mother's lullaby filled the small room. Luca's tears fell freely now as Alea whispered the opening words, "Sleep, my child, the stars are singing." The same words that had broken through his walls that first morning outside his tower. Sarah stepped forward, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Alea, how would you feel about spending more time with Mr. Moretti? We could start with regular visits, see how things go." Alea nodded, still watching Luca. "He knows the song," she said simply, as if that explained everything, and perhaps, in its own way, it did. The foster mother smiled encouragingly. "We could start with dinner visits, maybe some weekend afternoons." "I'd like that," Alea said softly, then turned to Luca. "Will you tell me more stories about your mama?" "Everyone I can remember," Luca promised. "And maybe together we can write some new ones." The rest of the visit passed in gentle conversation. Alea gradually relaxed, sharing details about her school and her current foster family. When it was time to leave, she surprised everyone by giving Luca a quick hug. "Miss Ruth says sometimes God puts broken pieces together to make something new," she whispered before pulling away. Luca watched her leave with her foster mother, his heart full of an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between hope and gratitude. Sarah approached with more paperwork, but her smile was genuine. "You've got a long road ahead," she warned, "but I think this could be good for both of you." "Thank you," Luca said sincerely, "for giving us a chance." Later that evening, as he sat in his temporary apartment reviewing housing listings, Luca could still hear Alea's soft voice singing those precious words. His mother's song, carried through years of silence by faith and love, had finally found its way home. The weeks that followed took on a gentle rhythm. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Luca would leave work early to spend time with Alaya at the Family Services Center. Sarah, their caseworker, always sat quietly in the corner, taking notes as they worked on homework together or played board games. Sometimes they simply talked, Alaya sharing stories about her mother and Luca opening up about his own childhood memories. Weekend visits grew longer and more relaxed. They explored parks, visited museums, and spent hours at the shelter with Miss Ruth. Alaya's foster family, the Hendersons, proved to be incredibly supportive, helping smooth the transition with experienced grace. "She sings more now," Mrs. Henderson told Luca one Saturday evening as he dropped Alaya back at their home. "Sometimes we hear her in her room, practicing that special song of yours." Behind the scenes, Luca's legal team worked tirelessly. They compiled character references, financial statements, and detailed plans for Alaya's care. Miss Ruth wrote a powerful letter describing the bond she'd witnessed forming between them. Even Alaya's teachers contributed reports about her improved confidence and academic engagement since Luca had entered her life. The home study process was intense. Sarah inspected every inch of the new apartment Luca had chosen, a warm, welcoming 3-bedroom in a family-friendly neighborhood, walking distance from both the shelter and a well-regarded elementary school. She reviewed his modified work schedule, emergency plans, and support systems. "You've thought of everything," Sarah remarked, checking off another item on her lengthy list. "It's clear how committed you are to this." Luca had nodded, thinking of all the ways his life had changed since that morning outside his tower. "She showed me what really matters," he said simply. Finally, after what felt like endless paperwork and interviews, the guardianship hearing date arrived. The courthouse loomed large and imposing that morning, its stone steps already warming in the early summer sun. Luca arrived early, his lawyer beside him, both dressed in careful suits. The Hendersons brought Alaya shortly after. She wore a pretty yellow dress, her hair done in neat braids tied with matching ribbons. Miss Ruth had come too, sitting in the back of the courtroom with several of the shelter's staff members who had taken time off to show their support. The proceedings began formally, with the judge reviewing documents and questioning various parties. Sarah presented her findings, speaking confidently about Luca's suitability as a guardian. The Hendersons testified about Alaya's positive progress during the transition period. When it was Alaya's turn to speak with the judge, she stood straight and tall, her voice clear and sure. "I know Mr. Luca will take good care of me," she said. "He understands about missing your mama and about how sometimes songs can say the things your heart can't find words for." The judge, a kind-faced woman with silver hair, leaned forward with interest. "I've read about this special song in the case files. Would you tell me about it?" Alaya glanced at Luca, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It's a lullaby," she explained. "Mr. Luca's mama wrote it for him when he was little, before she had to go away. Miss Ruth taught it to me at the shelter, but I only knew part of it then. Now Mr. Luca and I have been putting all the pieces together." "That sounds very special," the judge said warmly. The rest of the hearing proceeded smoothly. When the judge finally announced her decision to grant the guardianship, the room burst into quiet applause. Alaya's face lit up with a brilliant smile, and Luca had to wipe away tears. Outside on the courthouse steps, sunshine bathed everything in golden light. Well-wishers gathered around, offering congratulations. Miss Ruth hugged them both, whispering prayers of blessing. The Hendersons promised to stay in touch, having become dear friends through the process. Then Alaya tugged gently on Luca's sleeve. "Can I sing it now?" she asked. "The whole song. I've been practicing." Everyone fell quiet as Alaya took a deep breath. Her voice, clear and sweet, lifted into the morning air. "Sleep, my child, the stars are singing, heaven's light to earth they're bringing. Though the night may bring you sorrow, love will guide you to tomorrow. Rest your head upon my shoulder, Feel your heart grow stronger, bolder. In your dreams, remember always, you are cherished now and always. When the morning sun is rising, know that hope is still surviving. For my love will never leave you. In your heart I'll stay to guide you. The last note hung in the air like a blessing. Tears streamed freely down Luca's face as he recognized the complete version of his mother's lullaby. The lost verses finally restored through this remarkable child who had wandered into his life. Alaya reached up and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping trustingly around his. "That's the whole song," she said softly. "Your mama wrote it all down in that notebook we found. I've been learning it special for today." Luca knelt down and hugged her close, feeling decades of pain and loneliness finally release their hold on his heart. Here on these sun-warmed steps, surrounded by people who had helped make this miracle possible, he found himself at peace at last. "Thank you," he whispered to Alaya, though his gratitude extended far beyond her, to his mother, to Miss Ruth, to everyone who had kept love alive when all seemed lost. Alaya squeezed his hand and smiled, her eyes shining with joy and understanding far beyond her years. Together they stood in the morning light, two souls once adrift, now anchored by the healing power of a simple lullaby and the unshakable bonds of family found in the most unexpected ways. The seasons changed gently as summer faded into autumn. Leaves turned golden and crisp along the city streets where Luca and Alaya now walked to school together most mornings. Their new routine had settled into something beautiful and natural. Breakfast together, school drop-offs, afternoon homework sessions, and endless conversations about music and dreams. One crisp October morning, as they shared toast and orange juice, Alaya looked up from her math worksheet. "The shelter needs more help than just money, doesn't it?" she asked thoughtfully. Luca set down his coffee cup, struck by her insight. "You're right. It needs a whole new purpose, something bigger." That conversation sparked an idea that would grow into something remarkable. Over the next several weeks, Luca worked with his legal team to establish the Last Song Foundation, named in honor of his mother's final recording. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful: to provide music education and community support to children and families in need. The old shelter building underwent a dramatic transformation. Construction crews worked through November and December, carefully preserving the building's historic character, while creating modern music rooms, a small performance space, and updated living quarters for families in transition. Miss Ruth's office was renovated, but kept its warm, welcoming feel, right down to the worn, comfortable chairs where she had counseled so many troubled souls over the years. As winter settled in, Luca spent hours in meetings with music teachers, social workers, and community leaders. Alaya often sat in the corner during these sessions, drawing pictures and occasionally offering surprisingly wise suggestions. "We should have lots of different instruments," she said one day, "because everyone's heart sings differently." The foundation grew steadily, attracting support from unexpected places. Several well-known musicians, touched by the story of Luca's mother and her lost songs, donated instruments and offered to teach master classes. Local businesses contributed supplies and volunteers. The city council fast-tracked permits and zoning changes, recognizing the project's value to the community. Through it all, Miss Ruth remained the heart and soul of the operation. Though she initially protested any recognition, Luca insisted on naming the main performance space, Ruth's Hall, in her honor. "You kept the music alive when everyone else tried to silence it," he told her. "This place exists because of you." January brought heavy snow, but couldn't slow the progress. The foundation began offering its first programs: piano lessons for shelter residents, guitar classes for neighborhood kids, and a children's choir that quickly filled with eager voices. Alaya joined everything she could, soaking up music like a flower turning toward the sun. One particularly meaningful addition was the Mother's Song program, which provided recording equipment and studio time for parents to create musical legacies for their children. Every child should have a song to remember, Luca explained at a board meeting, his voice thick with emotion. By early spring, the transformation was complete. The once struggling shelter had become a vibrant community center while maintaining its crucial role as a safe haven for those in need. The walls, once gray and institutional, now wore warm colors and displayed children's artwork. Music filtered through the hallways at all hours, scales being practiced, songs being learned, lives being healed. Miss Ruth's official recognition ceremony was scheduled for a mild March evening. Despite her protests that she didn't need any fuss, the entire community turned out to celebrate her decades of service. Former residents returned to share stories of how she had changed their lives. Current shelter families presented her with a handmade quilt featuring musical notes and messages of gratitude. When it was Luca's turn to speak, he stood at the podium in Ruth's hall, looking out at the gathered faces, some wealthy donors, some shelter residents, all equal in this space. 25 years ago, he began, a frightened woman with a young son found refuge here. Miss Ruth didn't just offer her shelter, she protected her legacy, her music, her truth. That woman was my mother, and I stand here today because Miss Ruth understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do is keep a song alive until it can be heard again. The afternoon of the grand opening arrived bright and clear. Chairs filled the newly landscaped courtyard where the dedication ceremony would take place. Children from the music programs practiced their songs one last time. Alaya, dressed in a new blue dress, helped Miss Ruth pin on her corsage. Luca stood in his office, looking out over the transformed space. The building's old brick walls now held new windows that let in streams of sunlight. The sign above the entrance read, "The Last Song Foundation, where every voice matters." Below it, in smaller letters, "In memory of Eleanor Moretti, whose songs live on." As people began gathering in the courtyard, Luca felt a small hand slip into his. Alaya looked up at him with shining eyes. "Your mama would be so proud," she said softly. "This is better than any fancy building downtown." He squeezed her hand, grateful beyond words for the child who had brought music back into his life. Together they watched as Miss Ruth took her place near the podium, her face glowing with quiet joy as the dedication ceremony prepared to begin. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities and promise, as the foundation prepared to write its own new song. Strings of white lights twinkled in the trees surrounding the courtyard, and the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the assembled crowd. The children's choir took their places, sheet music rustling softly in the spring breeze. Miss Ruth sat in the place of honor, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her eyes sparkled with unshed tears of joy. The sunset painted warm streaks of orange and pink across the sky as Luca's modest sedan pulled into the driveway of their two-bedroom house. It wasn't the penthouse apartment he'd once owned, nor was it the sprawling mansion his wealth could have afforded. Instead, it was a simple home on a quiet street, with a small front yard where Alaya had planted marigolds and zinnias last spring. "Home, sweet home," Luca said, turning off the engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror to see Alaya already gathering her backpack and the folder of sheet music she'd received at the ceremony. The house represented everything that had changed in his life. After stepping down as CEO and reorganizing his priorities, Luca had made deliberate choices about their lifestyle. The move to this neighborhood hadn't been about financial necessity. It was about creating a normal, grounded life for Alaya and reminding himself daily of the values his mother had tried to instill in him. They walked up the concrete path together, past the chalk drawings Elia had made on the driveway last weekend. The porch light clicked on automatically, illuminating their way as Luca unlocked the front door. Inside, the house was warm and lived in, with Elia's artwork displayed proudly on the refrigerator and a collection of family photos lining the hallway wall. "I'm starving," Elia announced, dropping her backpack by the coat rack. "Can we make breakfast for dinner?" Luca smiled, remembering how his own mother used to make pancakes for dinner on special occasions. "That sounds perfect. Want to be my sous chef?" Together they moved around the kitchen with familiar ease, Elia measuring flour while Luca cracked eggs into a bowl. They had developed their own comfortable routines over the months since becoming a family. The kitchen radio played softly in the background. They always kept music playing somewhere in the house. "Miss Ruth looked so happy today," Elia said, carefully adding milk to their pancake batter. "I've never seen her cry happy tears before. She deserved every minute of it," Luca replied, heating up the griddle. "Without her, we might never have found each other." As they cooked, they talked about the ceremony, the children's choir performance, the community's response, the way the whole neighborhood seemed to come alive with possibility. Elia set the table while Luca flipped pancakes, making sure to create a few Mickey Mouse-shaped ones that never quite looked right, but always made her giggle. Finally, they sat down together at their small kitchen table, plates piled high with slightly misshapen pancakes, scrambled eggs, and fresh berries. Elia reached for Luca's hand, and he reached for hers, their nightly routine of saying grace before meals. "Dear God," Elia began, her voice clear and confident. "Thank you for this food and for this wonderful day. Thank you for Miss Ruth and the new music center and for all the people who will get help there. And thank you especially—" She paused, squeezing Luca's hand a little tighter. "For giving me a dad who loves me so much." Luca's heart caught in his throat at the word dad. It was the first time she had used it, though he had long since come to think of her as his daughter. He kept his eyes closed, feeling tears gather behind his eyelids as Elia finished the prayer. "Amen," they said together. Opening his eyes, Luca saw Elia watching him with a small, knowing smile. "Is it okay?" she asked softly. "That I called you Dad?" "More than okay," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the best gift you could have given me." They ate their breakfast dinner, talking and laughing about simple things. Elia's upcoming school science fair, the stray cat that kept visiting their backyard, the new songs she was learning in choir. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by the clink of forks and the passing of maple syrup. After dinner, they cleaned up together, with Elia insisting on drying the dishes even though they had a perfectly good dishwasher. It had become their ritual, these quiet moments of domestic partnership that made their house feel more like home with each passing day. Later, as the evening wound down, they sat together on the living room couch. Elia had changed into her favorite pajamas, the ones with music notes all over them, and was curled up next to Luca as he read aloud from the book they'd been working through together. When it was time for bed, Elia hugged him extra tight. "Good night, Dad," she said, testing out the word again, this time with more confidence. "I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," Luca replied, his heart full to bursting. He tucked her in, just as he did every night, making sure her stuffed elephant was properly positioned and her nightlight was on. Back in the living room, Luca sat quietly, letting the joy of the day wash over him. On the mantel, a framed photo showed him and Elia on the day he'd gained guardianship, both of them beaming at the camera. Next to it sat his mother's cassette tape in a special display case, preserved as a reminder of where their journey had begun. The house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. Through Elia's partially open door, he could hear her humming softly to herself as she drifted off to sleep. The same lullaby that had brought them together, now a regular part of their nighttime routine. In this modest home, with its mortgage payments and creaky floorboards and crayon marks on the walls, Luca had found something his wealth had never been able to buy: true happiness. As he listened to his daughter's gentle breathing from down the hall, he said a quiet prayer of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led them here, to this perfect moment of quiet joy. The sun painted the eastern sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Luca pulled into the parking lot of the last song, Center. Even at this early hour, music drifted through the building's open windows, a clear, sweet voice carrying on the morning breeze. He recognized the melody instantly. It was his mother's lullaby, but transformed through Elia's voice into something new, yet familiar, like seeing an old photograph in fresh light. Luca stood quietly in the doorway of the practice room, not wanting to interrupt. Elia sat at the upright piano, her fingers moving carefully over the keys as she sang. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced around her like tiny stars. Her voice filled the room with warmth, each note carrying the weight of generations, his mother's love, preserved and passed down through time and tragedy, now blooming again in this child who had become his daughter. The song spoke of hope and shelter, of finding home in the hearts of others. As Luca listened, he felt his mother's presence not as the sharp ache of loss that had haunted him for so long, but as a gift that had guided him here. Her disappearance had left a void that wealth could never fill, but through Elia, that emptiness had been transformed into something beautiful. He watched as Elia swayed gently with the music, her eyes closed in concentration. She had grown so much in the months since they'd found each other, more confident, more joyful, more secure in who she was and where she belonged. The scared little girl who had stood outside his tower seemed like a distant memory now. Closing his eyes, Luca let the music wash over him. In Elia's voice, he heard echoes of his mother's gentle strength, her unwavering faith, her ability to find light in the darkest places. He understood now that this, not the empire he'd built or the fortune he'd amassed, was his true inheritance, the capacity to love deeply, to trust again, to believe in miracles. The morning light grew stronger, filling the room with golden warmth as Elia's song drew to a close. In this moment, surrounded by music and morning light, Luca felt the full circle of their journey, from loss to discovery, from isolation to family, from darkness to dawn. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.